Okay, 6:03, we'll get started. Thank you all for joining me once again. I don't really know how many times this has been, probably somewhere in the area of 25 times over the last year and a bit, maybe give or take a couple of times. But anyway, so thank you for joining me. I wish I could really be insightful right now to tell everybody what's going on. The reality is everybody in Israel at the moment is confused, not exactly sure what's happening or if anything's happening or other negotiations taking place? Is Trump administration negotiating behind our backs with Hamas, which most Israelis would approve of, but that's a different story altogether. Um, are we going to go back to war? We just announced we're cutting off electricity to Gaza as of tonight. It won't make a big difference, but it'll make some sort of difference, maybe. I mean, it won't pressure Hamas to do anything. It just sounds good domestically, which is part of the problem. Um, we're preparing. We have a new chief of staff. He sounds militant, not in the political sense, but raring to go. This time it'll be different, etc., etc. Uh, but nobody has been able to come up with anything that says why will this time be different, other than the fact that a lot less reserve troops are um, showing up for duty when they're being called up to reserves. If at the beginning of the war it was 120% who were showing up, towards the middle we ended up at 85%. Rumor has it we're now down to 60%, and that's not good. It's hard to go fight a war when only 60% of your troops show up, and that number is going to go down, especially if we decide to go to war um, against the view of the majority of the Israeli public. And somewhere between 70 and 80% of the Israeli public are against going back to war at the moment, in favor of making a deal to get back to the hostages. Uh, Not that they don't want to get rid of Hamas. I don't know an Israeli from the far left to the far right who doesn't wish Hamas was gone tomorrow morning and doesn't even think that it's worth fighting to get rid of Hamas, but just not now. Just not before we get back our hostages, number one, and most strongly. That's the first requirement. Because if we go to war again, we're going to get back bodies if we ever even get back the bodies. And number two, because we're not ready to go back to war. I mean, yes, the army has had a month wait, but we're not ready. The army needs to be rebuilt, rethought, all sorts of things, and not to mention the fact that a successful attack on Hamas needs to be a surprise attack. It can't be an attack which they're waiting for. All the few times we've had success against Hamas is when we've surprised them. We're obviously not going to surprise them right now if we go back to war. And so, not to mention, our economy needs to come back. We just now the airlines mostly coming back and flying here, all those sort of things. We need time. We need time to get the laser system that's going to be deployed in the course of this year deployed, so that next time when the Houthis or anyone else gets involved, we have even a better defense. But we don't know. It's all somewhat dependent on President Trump on one hand and Netanyahu's political needs on the other hand. And they're all collapsing with each other or in some form or another. So we really, really don't have a good handle on what comes next. We know that Netanyahu is desperate right now to keep his coalition together. At the moment, he is on the verge of not having enough votes to pass the budget because of the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft. The government was unable to pass a bill. The ultra-Orthodox demanded a draft exemption bill before they passed the budget. That's not happening. And the question now becomes, at least some parts, if not all of the ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset may not vote with the government to pass the budget. And without that, he's on the ice unless he gets Ben-Gvir to support him. It's unclear. It's unclear what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And of course, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have made it clear that he's only going to support the government if we go back to war some more. I find it ironic and sad that the people who most want to go back to the war, people like Smotrich, who was barely in the army, Ben-Gvir, who was never in the army, these are the people that think that war was going to solve the problem at this point. Because I frankly do not know, how we solve the problem by by warfare, certainly not at this stage. I had just a few minutes ago, when I took my dog out for a walk, I ran into one of my friends who is a ex-general, general reserve. He's a man in his late 80s, and he was awfully depressed. He was used to be the commander of the tank corps, among other things, and he knows Amir, but he thinks we're really going down the wrong path at this point, and he doesn't know how we fix it. And his concern, of course, is for his grandkids at this point. Obviously, nothing's going to change in this short enough period of time. So um, I think more than anything else, it's the uncertainty, and the uncertainty is the major thing that we're all facing at the moment, and we don't know uh, where it's going to go from here. The hostages, Trump is trying to pull off um, for Bibi's part, plan A plus. Don't forget, we signed an agreement that said we were going to go and negotiate the second stage of the agreement. That was supposed to have taken place 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, but we didn't start that negotiations for political reasons. Whether it would have succeeded or not, I have no idea. The minimal demands of Hamas and our minimal demands probably don't meet, but we didn't even try because we didn't enter into that negotiations. According to the deal, which Hamas kept basically 100%, um, we were supposed to pull out of the Philadelphia corridor this week. We didn't, and we're not. So we're violating the agreement. Now, okay, they're a terrorist organization, they're a terrible organization, they're terrible people, and we can go through all those things. But the reality is we're the ones who are violating agreements. And if we want to get more hostages out, that doesn't sound to me to be the sound policy. Can we push them? Can we squeeze them? I don't know. I question it. Um, I question we're fighting a group of people who are religiously committed to fighting us. They're religiously committed to destroying us. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying any. I wouldn't even say something a quarter positive about Hamas. They are religiously committed to destroying and killing us. But they're also sometimes pragmatic. Sometimes they're not pragmatic. But they want to rebuild their strength. We are obsessed, in my opinion, with not allowing October 7th to happen again. Rightly so. We can never allow October 7th to happen again. But October 7th will never happen again if our army is actually there and ready to fight, as opposed to what happened, which was we didn't have an army on the border on October 7th. If we would have had an army on October 7th, October 7th would have ended completely differently. And I hope at least that the various investigations that the army undertook have looked at some of the problems. I don't think they did it deep enough, and they went under the hood enough to look at some of the underlying problems that we have. But I'm hopeful that this will never happen again. Something else will happen. If it took 50 years between Yom Kippur War and this war for us to be strategically surprised in the way we were, I have no doubt sometime in the future we will be surprised again because that's the nature of life, but not in this way. And it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I think that's important. And we can't say, well, if we pull out of here or there, it's just going to bring another October 7th next week. Well, it took them many years to pull off on October 7th, and it took our participating, not actively, obviously, but not being on guard. I doubt, in my lifetime at least, we'll be caught in a situation where we won't be on guard. We won't assume that we have an intelligence in order to defend ourselves. And yes, we're going to use intelligence, we'll do everything we can, but we're going to also assume the fact that we're prepared even if we don't get the warnings we need in order um, to repel any sort of attack. So that's the sort of confused position we're in right now. I say confused because I'm confused. Last night getting various notifications, one notification would completely contradict the other. Israel and Hamas has reached an agreement on extending the ceasefire. Israeli sources say, no, there's been no progress made whatsoever on the discussions. Hamas and the United States have made lots of progress in terms of the negotiations. Israel says, no, there's been no progress made whatsoever. The talks are about to blow up. And literally, I could sit here and watch the notifications come left, right, and center, and no one really knows what's really happening, other than I guess the people directly involved, and they're not talking. Um, the big question, obviously, the visit by the hostages to the White House was considered by many put it a success, but successful in reigniting President Trump's interest in the hostages. The fear here was that he was losing interest and moving on to whether it's Ukraine or all the multitude of other issues that he has engaged himself in. The visit brought home what's happened to the hostages. And look, the people who, you know, one of the people who was there, I mean, he was out of Hamas care less than a week, and he was on a plane to see Trump because Trump was considered the only person who can bring about anything. Um, it's a very sad thing. It's taking as an Israeli that President Biden first, and now President Trump, have met with more hostage families, hostages, everywhere you want to look at it. There's clearly more chemla, more sense of kindness and concern have been shown repeatedly by both American governments than has been shown by our own government towards the hostage families, and in this case, the hostages themselves. Um, it's something I don't understand, to be honest with you, because I mean, as anyone who's been listening to me or reading me over the years, I'm not exactly a great fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he is an excellent politician. And at least one of the things that a politician knows how to do is to, make believe you care, show that you care. And, I don't understand. I don't understand why he hasn't shown uh, more caring, been more involved, shows that he cares. His inability to go visit the kibbutzim that were most hurt, his inability, I think I wrote about it. I walk through Hostage Square almost every single morning. It's part of my morning routine. I walk with my dog. We walk through there. It's a couple of blocks from my house. And the trial that he's been engaged in, the courtroom is literally abuts it. Literally, the other side of one of the edges of the Hostage Square is the courthouse. And you would think, early in the morning before anyone got there, he would have at least made a visit to Hostage Square. But no, he hasn't done it at all. Makes no sense. There are 57, it's supposedly 57 hostages left, of which 24, 22, we're not totally sure, are thought to be alive. There may actually be a few more alive than we thought. It's not totally clear. But some of them are pretty sick at the moment, at least according to reports. But why is this? Sorry, I went back from the point. So the issue being, why? And I don't understand why. I truly don't understand why. Politicians are usually good at those sort of things, right? Retail politics. But I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has been living in his own bubble for so long that he doesn't know how to engage in it. Maybe he never did, because the Israeli system is such that you only really have to fight in your primaries more than anything else. But that's the reality. In the meantime, we have the letter that President Trump sent to the Iranians, which basically said, "I'm ready to negotiate, but if you don't want to negotiate, there are other solutions," hinting on military options. We'll have to see. The Iranians, I think, were stupid by somebody has their, please mute yourself. The Iranians were stupid, in my opinion, by not saying, "Oh, we'll be happy to negotiate," and then take a year to negotiate or whatever, just drag it on. But they said no, which is not in my opinion, the right policy for them, not for us, but for them. So we'll have to see. I don't think the United States is going to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities. I hope they do with us, because we can only go so far. The U.S. is much more capable. But of course, a real agreement would be better, quite honestly. A real agreement that's actually enforceable would be a better solution. The Iranians kept the other agreement, the one that we walked away from. They kept it. The problem with the other agreement was that it sunset. It ended at a certain point. So a better, longer agreement would be better, because you never know what happens with the military confrontation. You really don't. We were very successful in knocking down all the ballistic missiles, or almost all of them. Uh, I'm not looking forward to a few more nights where suddenly there are 50 missiles heading towards Tel Aviv, and hoping that our systems knock them all down. It probably will, 95% of them, but still, not the way to live if you don't have to live that way. So we'll have to see where that goes. Domestically, like I said, there's been no success at reaching an agreement in terms of the ultra-Orthodox draft. Uh, their minimal position is way, and the position of the rest of the country are just too far apart. It's just no way to put it. They do not want their students to serve in the army, period. End of story. Uh, it goes against, look, it's not so much of studying in yeshivot that is so important. Yes, it's very important to them, etc. I understand that. And they've created a myth that the studying in the yeshivot are what has kept the Jewish people. Never before have, 95% of a community studied in yeshivot. It's always been the most brilliant kid in the community was sent to somewhere to study in the yeshiva, not everybody. But leave that part aside. The whole idea of the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, somewhat in the United States too, a little bit less, but somewhat, is to create a wall between them and the rest of society. They don't want their kids um, to see what's going on and uh, to decide they want to live a secular life, well, not even a secular life, a national, a religious but not ultra-Orthodox life. Let's remember what happened in Europe. In Europe, when the Enlightenment came to Europe, 50% of the ultra-Orthodox communities in Europe disintegrated. Most of them moved to America and sometimes to other places because the Enlightenment came. They suddenly learned something else. They turned to different viewpoints. The Enlightenment is all over, all around them here in Israel, and they've built walls to keep the Enlightenment out of their communities. But people are people, and despite the education they've gotten against the quote unquote Enlightenment, I have no doubt that the results would be relatively similar if all of the young people, I don't know how to define that, but younger people were exposed to the world of ideas beyond the ultra-Orthodox world. A really high percentage of them would no doubt choose uh, alternate lifestyles. Again, they're not going to, most of them wouldn't become secular, but a lot of them would become what one would describe as modern Orthodox. And some of them, of course, would walk away completely because you go from extreme to extreme in life, and that's a different story. But anyway, the bottom line is the ultra-Orthodox won't agree to anything that requires a substantial number of them to actually draft. The rest of society won't allow this to continue, especially when we have a shortage of manpower. Um, and therefore, there is no easy solution. They haven't been able to find a solution. As much as Netanyahu has promised them a solution, he hasn't been able to get a few of the key people in Likud to go along with that position, which everyone in Likud knows is a extremely unpopular view amongst most of the population here. Now, what he is trying to do right now is continuation of the quote unquote judicial reform or judicial revolution, or however you want to call it. That without making huge statements, by doing incremental things that will have the same effect, trying to change the committee that selects justices to the Supreme Court. That's one way of affecting the change. Now they're doing their best to try to remove the Attorney General from a position. She is very unpopular amongst some of the Likud ministers because she says what they want to do is illegal, and why should the law stay and block their way? And that's happened repeatedly over the last year and a half. Now, don't forget the Attorney General has agreed to 98% of what the government wants, but 2% of the time she says you can't do that because it's illegal. Or she says when the Supreme Court says you have to draft everybody, she comes back to the government and says you have to draft everybody. That means send out draft notices to all of the ultra-Orthodox kids. And if they don't show up, then eventually they become draft evaders. And if you become a draft evader, you can't leave the country, you can't get a license. There are all sorts of other things. You can be put in jail, but no one's putting them in jail yet. But they're doing other things to limit them. And she basically interprets the law, and they don't want to interpret it that way. They want it to be, to allow them to do what they want to do. So that's why they're trying their best to put her out. The second reason And why the timing is, as you know, Netanyahu's trial has been going on forever. Israel needs judicial reform, but not changing the relationship between the High Court and the government. It needs judicial reform so trials don't take years. And there are a lot of ways to limit it, and they're just not done. I mean, the idea that Netanyahu can sit there day after day going through every single thing that took place and having his attorney question him, and so his attorney's questioning him for 50 days in a row. Think about that. That's an incredible thing. It would never happen in an American courtroom. You'd be given 3 days, 5 days, 7 days for the witness, some number of days, and that would be the end of it. But here it's almost unlimited, although the court finally said you can only have 12 more sessions of his testimony from the side of the defense. What he's trying to avoid, as much as he can, is what's going to happen afterwards when the prosecution gets to ask him questions. Because right now he's answering questions that his lawyers are using, softball, giving him questions to answer. They're preparing the questions, and he knows in advance, and they talk about it in advance. And so here's this and this and this, what happened on this day, and they're all prepared for that answer, and they're all set. In 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 8 weeks, if they keep on pushing it, or 10 weeks, whatever it is, the prosecution is going to start asking him questions. And those questions he's not going to know in advance. He's not going to know from where it's coming from. He's going to have to answer them. And he's trying to avoid at all costs that happening. What he'd like to do is replace the Attorney General with somebody who is more willing to make a deal with him. That would be, a really soft deal and let him off, basically, from all the things that he's on trial for. Israelis, by and large, at this point, are sorry he was put on trial because it's ended up with this crazy situation that he's taken us through, all to attempt to avoid being found guilty of the things that he's no doubt guilty of. On the other hand, people talk about the French law. The French law basically says that a president or prime minister can't be put on trial while he was in office. But the president of France has term limits. So you can't have a French law without term limits. If we had term limits in this country, we could have a French law. Without term limits, it becomes impossible. And so, because that means someone could stay in office forever and never be tried for a crime. So that keeps on going. There's an attempt to get her out. It's a complicated problem in order to get her out. It's not so simple. He can't just fire her. The government can't just fire her. And he himself isn't directly in Nigud Inyanim, which is, in English, that means he's conflict of interest, my wife says correctly, a conflict of interest. And so he can't do that. So there are various attempts. It would be a long process to do it, and it's not clear he'd succeed in doing it even after the whole process goes forward. We'll have to see. But that is a point where it might finally bring Israelis out in the streets in large enough numbers. It's hard to get people out. I mean, last night there were demonstrations all around the army headquarters to make a deal, not go back to war. But the numbers, there was a nice number. There were tens of thousands of people, but there weren't millions of people. And in order to have any effect, if it has any effect, and that's always the problem, so 1 million people come out. It's hard to know whether it'll make a big difference. The universities today announced the fact that they're going to recommend individual strikes if she does that. What does that mean? The universities themselves can't go on strike because that becomes illegal, but they can recommend that their professors and everyone else personally go on strike. So we'll see where that goes. I don't know. This government doesn't care. And that's the inherent problem. The government doesn't care about the things that most governments would care about. The government is pretty insensitive to public opinion to a very large extent. Maybe they become more sensitive when we get closer to the election. Clearly not. They talk about the will of the people. This is the most insane situation when you think about it, right? They talk about the fact that anyone who opposes the government is opposing the will of the people. Well, this government was barely elected by probably a half a percentage point of the population, but leave that part aside. It has not had support. It has not had support of the majority of the country since the electoral reform began, and certainly not since since the war began. The numbers vary from 48 to 52, but that's about that's about the percentage of the people that not 40%, but 48 Knesset members over 120. So we're talking about probably 40%, 35 to 40% support the government. Um, one of the things I wrote for tonight's update, which I didn't touch on now, was the fact that the Army spokesman, Rear Admiral Hagari, was basically fired. It's a little more complicated. That was basically fired because basically he was too popular. 73% of the population believed in him, while only 18% didn't. That's compared to 32% of the population that believes when Netanyahu speaks, against 68% that doesn't believe in Netanyahu. So he was let go. The government doesn't have a spokesman. I mean, just think about it. Maybe there's someone officially, but there's no spokesman. He's the only person who repeatedly has spoken to the Israeli people on the worst days of the last year and a half. It was Hagari that got in front of the TV and announced the terrible things that had happened. Never Netanyahu, never a government spokesman. It's always Hagari, the army spokesman, who's been there consistently for all of us over this period of time. But he's being pushed out of the army. So that's where we stand. A couple of last things. Number one, one can't ignore what just happened in Syria yesterday and the day before. The new government killed 1,000 Alawites. Alawites being the group that supported Assad. I have not seen the world condemning what took place over the weekend in Syria. We, on the other hand, have had this rather muscular policy of moving forward our lines. I'm not even sure if I agree or disagree with it. It's very hard to know where the Syria is going and what risks should or should not be taken in terms of Syria. It could end up being very dangerous. It could end up being positive. We still don't know. It's still too early, to say the least. In the meantime, one last area, of course, is the West Bank, Yudav Shomron. There have been very active army efforts there over the last couple of weeks. They've successfully killed a number of terrorists. They've arrested some people. I don't know. This has been ongoing basically since at least 2000. And it continues to be the same situation. And what's sad is that at the beginning of the war, when we cut off the West Bank from being able to come into Israel and work, the army was against it and warned that by doing that, you're going to explode. You have an explosion in the West Bank, and we did it anyway because populist view is to stop it. And so instead, the workers who have passed security approvals are not coming in. Meanwhile, illegal ones managed to sneak across and work here, but not in the same numbers, not providing the money for the families. And of course, we've been trying to cut back the funds that the Palestinian Authority gets because to too many people, as I heard one Likud member of Knesset say today, they're both Nazis. Hamas and the PA, they're both Nazis, equal Nazis. They're both bad, so just got to fight both of them. Well, maybe. I don't think they're Nazis. I don't think they hate us. Even the PA probably hates us, but they're willing to make a deal with us. Hamas will never be willing to make a deal with us. So it's a choice to be made. There are different degrees of evil, the different types of enemies, and you can't always choose your enemies. It's just the reality of life. Okay, we're past the halfway point. At this point, I'll open up for any questions. Raise your hand. Hopefully, I'll see it, or my wife will yell at me and say I'm missing somebody. Okay, Paul.
Yeah, so you didn't say anything about the Arab summit, which is supposedly trying to come up with a solution to what's going to happen to Gaza. And the thing I'm curious about with that is the one country that seems to be pushing for a role for Hamas in the post-war is Egypt, which, since they have such a rancorous relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, I would think Egypt would be the one who would not want Hamas. So what game is Egypt? I guess two questions. What game is Egypt playing? And two, could this summit end up with basically a hard line, no Hamas at all, must get out, or we don't provide any aid?
Okay, so the answer is yes and no. The problem with this summit is not so much that Hamas is there, because is willing to stand back. The issue is, I think we should have embraced the summit's views and said under one condition, Hamas has to disarm. Because you're not going to eliminate Hamas. Let's be realistic here. Hamas has support of something between 40 and 60 and 80% of the people in Gaza. There's no one else who's more popular. There's no one else who's going to beat them at the moment. There's no one else who has people on the ground. Uh, so the only thing you can do is you can demand that they be disarmed in return for aid, in return for the rebuilding. And that's what needs to be done. But look, we have people in our government who still are dreaming of resettling Gaza. And as long as they are controlling things, the swing votes and passing the budget, it's going to be really hard to get any sort of plan through. And you know, there is no scenario. Look, of course there's the Trump plan where all these people are going to magically go somewheres. But even Trump doesn't believe in the Trump plan anymore. Just the Israeli right believes in the Trump plan. Look, I don't know very many Israelis that wouldn't agree that if magically all of the people in Gaza wanted to suddenly live, I don't know, somewhere's nice. I don't wish them bad. Some was nice where they wouldn't create anti-Semitism, but they all went there. We'd be very happy. But they're going to hate us there anyway, so I'm not sure it really helps us. But the reality is, what's going to happen to Gaza? Something's going to have to, someone's going to have to pay for rebuilding what we destroyed at some point, some ways down the line. We have to demand it only happens if Gaza is demilitarized. But we don't participate in any of this. This is part of our problem. We're not negotiating. We're not participating. We're just sort of saying no. And we don't have our own ideas. Have you heard of an Israeli plan? Netanyahu finally said, "You've been asking me where's the plan for the day after?" And after Trump gave his wonderful plan for the Riviera of the Gaza, he said, "That's our plan. You see, that was our plan all along. I've been quiet because that's our plan for Gaza." Really? Does anyone actually think the Trump plan has any realistic chance of succeeding? Like I said, in my dreams it could happen, but I don't expect my dreams to come true in terms of that. So, anyone else? Yes, Ian. Ian, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just had to unmute. Hi, Mark. Just a remark and then my question. I came back from Tel Aviv about a week ago and took a short walk through Hostages Square, and it's really moving. I don't know how you walk through there every day. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. I don't think I could do it. But anyway, to get back to my question, a friend of mine, Anat Saragusti, wrote a piece in Haaretz the last day or two, when she talks about the breaking or the shattering of a whole lot of concepts and norms that Israel has really acted by, and which in part led up to October 7th. One of the norms has been that everything is solvable through force, despite the fact that there have been some attempts, like Oslo and others, to use non-kinetic means to come to some sort of settlement. The regression, or what's always been gone back to, is force. Do you think there's any hope that post-October 7th, post this war, there'll be a move away from the use of force and more of a move towards political means and non-kinetic means in order to achieve solutions?
Okay, that's a complicated question. So let's break that apart. Part of the problem with the fact that Israel seems to only use force, and I don't necessarily totally agree with that, but let's stick with that for the moment, is we never have had a foreign policy. We don't have a foreign policy. We never do. Kissinger's famous statement is true. Israel only has a domestic policy, a domestic political policy, and that ends up being its foreign policy. So in order to use non-kinetic means, you have to have some sort of goal, something to be achieved. You can believe or not believe in Oslo, but there was an idea, it was pursued, It may not have worked out. It didn't work out, in my opinion, mostly because of the Hamas and the Palestinians, but that's a different argument to be made. But there was a goal, there was an idea, and it took place. Look, we had a peace agreement with Egypt. It was solved. It required a kinetic force by the Egyptians to get us to the table, which was the Yom Kippur War, but it required the involvement of Kissinger in order to start the process going, which he successfully did. And then it required Anwar Sadat to take that huge step of coming to visit us to break the psychological boundaries. It wasn't our people that broke the boundaries, it was Sadat who broke the psychological boundaries. So, on the other hand, look, I mean, we had agreements that were made at the end of the War of Independence, the armistice agreements that came to. Those were not by force; those were agreements that were reached. After 56, there was an agreements that were reached, and of course, after 67, no one was willing to reach any agreements with us. There were the three no's of Khartoum. So, it takes two sides. And I think when we look back, we made a lot of mistakes over the years, but frankly, the Palestinians have made many more mistakes. There are many more opportunities that were lost by them because they insisted on forever fighting us in one form or another, much more so. They were not willing to do the basic compromises that were required to reach a peace agreement. Look, they could have had a stake with the Barak plan or the Clinton plan that immediately followed it. It would have been a Palestinian state back then. I mean, forget 1947 if they would have accepted the partition plan. But they have not been willing to accept our existence as a basis for a final peace agreement. So I don't think we're always the ones who think kinetic force is what's best. Look, we didn't start most of these wars. We didn't start October 7th. Clearly, we didn't start October 7th. We didn't start the Yom Kippur War. The Six-Day War, while we initiated the actual tactical beginning of the war, also we didn't initiate it. It was initiated by Nasser by going into the Sinai, and we begged King Hussein not to get involved, and he got involved anyway and started firing on West Jerusalem and started moving his troops into West Jerusalem. So we didn't start very many. Well, we didn't look for kinetic solutions to most things. It just so happens that our kinetic abilities are better than our diplomatic abilities, so we do better kinetically. But so I don't accept the basic premise there. Although there's truth to the facts have shown that we haven't achieved a lot diplomatically, but we did make attempts. We did make attempts. So, Claude,
Iron Dome. Do we have sufficient Iron Dome munitions? And if we do, I know we couldn't do it publicly, but Ukraine is in real trouble with us stepping away. I've spoken to two people, and without Iron Dome, Putin is going to take full advantage of that opportunity. Does Israel have enough munitions to send munitions to Ukraine? I know it's diplomatically a problem.
right? So okay, so two parts that I don't know what enough means is number one. It's a problem.
Some, any, more
Well,
than
I
we.
don't know. I literally don't know. In other words, don't forget the Iron
Okay,
Dome is made up of two parts or three parts, to be more accurately. It's made up of the missiles themselves, which we
right.
used up a lot during the war, but I'm sure we've been. I mean, I know for a fact we've been working 24/7 producing more of them. They're the missile systems to launch them,
They have the systems.
and they don't have our system. They don't have the system. They don't have those systems. No, the systems are specific to Iron Dome. It's not a traditional. It's not a traditional system. It's a specific system tied to a radar system, and most importantly, a computer system that is the success of Iron Dome has a lot to do with its computers and its ability to calculate where it's supposed to go and how it's supposed to intercept and all those things. They also probably need the arrow and not necessarily Iron Dome because a lot of what they're being hit by with some ballistic missiles. And third, they're also being hit by the one thing we're not really great at, which is drones. They seem to be better at firing, knocking down drones than we are. So, but then we get to the biggest problem. Look, even when the United States was fully supporting Ukraine, we didn't. And I thought, I thought all along that was a mistake. And I wrote about the fact that I was embarrassed the fact that we weren't supporting Ukraine. Now with Trump turning into a Putin ally, are we ready to go up against Trump over this? I don't think so.
Okay.
Trump wants Ukraine to lose. in my opinion. Trump wants, Trump is an ally of Putin. There's no two ways about it, in my opinion, at this point. So are we going to go up against Trump right now? No. I mean, as much as I wish we would, but we're not. We can't.
It was a loaded question.
I know it was a loaded question, but um, can we make, can we reshuffle things and become Europe's best friend? We could on some levels. Europe really needs us right now. They're trying to rearm, and we have the technology that they don't have. We probably don't have the manufacturing capability that they need in terms of large numbers, but we have the technology that they don't have. They're already buying an awful lot from us at this point. But the Europeans are, fair weather friends to some extent. America may become one soon based on the recent, Gallup polls and everything else. Support is dropping fairly rapidly in the United States for Israel, but let's assume the American people will stay with us a while longer. Europe, it's very hard to know. It really is hard to know. So we really can't you know, put our balls in that basket at this point.
Understood. Thank you for your time.
Victor.
Yeah, a relatively mundane question I wrote in the chat. So when people don't get called up for service and they don't show up, what happens? Anything?
Very little, because they usually have good excuses. Look, if you've been called for 200 days this year and you're operating your business and your business is about to go under, no one's going to make you to do reserve duty. Even when I did reserve duty 40 years ago, I had a small business, and often I would say, listen, this is if 40 days is a bit much, my business is in trouble, and my commander would let me out after 20 days. And that's after doing, 40 days for the year or 30 days for the year. So there's excuses. And listen, the people they're talking to are similar to them. It's not like, the unit commander is also going to be someone who's doing reserve duty and knows how difficult it is and everything else, and is very receptive to the problems that they're having. This is a real problem. There's a real problem in the army of even the regular army people getting leaving the army in larger numbers.
And
So
and they can get out, and the guy can make the excuse for the person saying, I don't want to come, and the commander can say, sure, that's okay.
yeah, so it's a decent excuse, or you can just, what? Once upon a time, you needed to get approval to be out to go out of the country. In other words, years ago, when I used to live here years ago, before any trip, I had to go to a place in the army and get approval to leave the country. Now there's no such thing. And even people about to draft can leave the country. So, okay, I have reserve duty next week. Well, you know what? It's time to take a nice trip to Switzerland for 2 weeks. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of the country. What can you do for me? I'm like out of the country. Because there's no such
And
limitation.
nothing about the Orthodox. They don't show up. They've been drafted, but nothing about them.
Okay, so the ones who don't show up at this point, it goes through cycles. So when you don't show up the first time, you get a second notice, and then a third notice. At that point, you're then considered to be AWOL, the equivalent of. At that point, they can take certain things. Number one, you won't be able to leave the country. If you show up at passport control, you'll be stopped from leaving the country. Number two, you can be arrested, and you won't be able to get a driver's license. But the heads of the yeshiva says, great, I don't want them going out of the country. I want them sitting in the yeshiva all the time. Why do I want them to go traveling? So it's a limitation. The problem is really so that they don't get money from the state. That's the main thing we can do is turn off the spigot, because over a lifetime they get an awful lot of money for sitting in the yeshiva, and that's really a problem. So no good solutions. No good solutions, which is part of the problem is when you have a situation where, make me the king, I'm not sure what I would do. So, Michael. Richard.
Yes, I'm Mark. This is also somewhat of a loaded question, but let's say things are pretty much the same when the next Israeli election occurs. Would we, in your opinion, end up with a weak coalition government again, or would we end up with something totally different?
Okay, as of right now, based on the polls, we'll end up with a different election. We'll end up with a government that will not include the ultra-Orthodox, will not include Likud, and will not include Ben Gvir and Smotrich. That's as of right now. If things stay the same, then we'll end up, will it be a large majority? No, but it'll be a big enough majority to govern. So that's where it is right now. Netanyahu has been trying for the longest time, to have a comeback, but it hasn't moved his poll, a little bit up. It got up a couple of Knesset members and then back down. He hasn't succeeded in rehabilitating himself. His core supporters keep on supporting him, but that's really as far as it goes. The Israeli public has moved to the right, theoretically, but so has the politicians. In other words, the most left-wing mainstream politician is Yair Golan, who's the head of the Democrats, which is a combination of Meretz and Labor. And Meretz was always, 100% in favor of a Palestinian state as soon as possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yair Golan basically says we need to work towards separation. Eventually, there should probably be a Palestinian state, but nothing anytime, he didn't say in his lifetime, but anything in the foreseeable future, the idea of an independent Palestinian state is off the table. And so that's the most left-wing Israeli mainstream politician. So the public has moved to the right, but it's also moved. It's moved. The politicians have moved with them to some extent because that's really the view of most people. But on top of which, the big issues are very much the sense of corruption and incompetence that this government has more than anything else, and the feeling that we don't want the government to be tied to the ultra-Orthodox. That problem needs to be dealt with once and for all, and needs to be dealt with before it becomes too late. When I say becomes too late, when it's really a question of demographics. Demographics at some point it becomes too late. So, anyone else?
Mark, it's
Yeah,
Michael.
go ahead. Oh, there's Michael. Go ahead.
Right. Backing up to 2 or 3 questions ago about not offending President Trump, Netanyahu, at least, unless something's changed, I believe, made an effort to have not been friends with Putin, at least to make sure he was not against us. He took Putin on a tour to a monument, thanking the Russians for liberating Auschwitz at a time when all the former Soviets tore down all the Russian monuments. Putin, to the best of my knowledge, wasn't using the air defenses in Syria to knock down Israeli planes. Has any of that changed? Is it still in effect, or who knows?
No, as a matter of fact, there's stories that they were trying to get arrange for the Russians to stay in Syria, which is interesting. No, we've maintained relations with the Russians for better or for worse, to my embarrassment to some extent, but that's a reality. El Al has continued, except, it stopped flying to Moscow only recently when there was that plane that got accidentally shot down recently. If you remember, I forgot what airline, Azerbaijan or one of those countries, airliners accidentally got shot down by Russian anti-aircraft systems. So El Al stopped flying to Moscow, but only recently and only for safety reasons, not for political reasons. All through the war, El Al was probably the only Western airline that was still flying to Moscow. So we've maintained reasonable relations with Russia for better or for worse. And we still have reasonable relations with Russia, from all I can tell. They have an embassy here. They obviously got the Hamas to release an Israeli Russian. And look, I think Putin is a very problematic person, to say the least. I think he's a dictator, and I think a lot of negative things about him. But I don't think he hates us. He has some sort of a soft spot for us. It has something to do with a teacher of his that moved to Israel years ago. The stories are that he bought her an apartment in Tel Aviv. And this was someone who had a big impact on him when he was a kid. So he doesn't hate us. But for whatever it's worth. Does it mean he will give up Russian interests in our favor? No, but if he can play at the edges, he'll play at the edges in our favor, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Paul? Go ahead, Paul. Paul and then
Yeah,
Ian.
talking about Syria, so there were reports that Putin obviously wants to maintain bases in Syria that he had under Assad, and might even extradite Assad to Syria as a price for that. Do you think it would be in Israel's interest if Putin did get back into Syria? And B, how do you think that'll play out?
Israel seems to think it's in its interest to be a balance against Turkey. I don't really know. I don't really know what's in Israel's interest when it comes to this. Don't forget, Putin at the moment is aligned with Iran to a very large extent. So it's very hard to separate the two. On the other hand, there are those who think that Trump is trying to play a multiple level game in terms of Ukraine and Iran and all those sort of things. I don't think he's capable of that, but maybe he is. I don't know. Um, I can't answer the question. I really can't, and I'm not going to try to answer because I don't really know what's in our interest when it comes to that. What we don't have is a strategic plan. I'll write today. We attended Eitan and I what's called Shabbat Tarbut, which is like a cultural thing. It's called Shabbat, but it was on Friday in the Ben Gurion library, literally in his house in the library there, and a bunch of different interesting people spoke. And well, I wrote it up, and you can read it in tonight's update. But the one thing I'll say was very clear: Israel never has had a strategic plan, defense and strategy plan that exists. Nothing formal, nothing even informal. And in order to accomplish things, you need some sort of a strategy plan, whether it's the American two-ocean plan that became, excuse me, two-war plan that existed for many, many years, the ability of the U.S. Army to fight on two wars simultaneously, Pacific and Europe, has been switched to 1.5 wars about, I don't know how many years ago, 20 years ago or something, where the U.S. should be capable of defense in one theater and offense in the other theater. Israel doesn't even have a plan on that limited basis. In order to accomplish things, you need a plan. But then our weakest, if I had to define the weakest point in Israel society overall, lack of planning. And that's the single weakest point in relating to almost everything. And that goes across the board, whether it's transportation, whether it's military, whether it's economy, all those things. So the military is a little better in terms of planning, especially places like the Air Force and the Navy, which require rather long lead times, because you got to decide what plane you want 5 or 10 years from now. So you have to have some sort of plan when it comes to those sort of things. But generally speaking, it's the strongest thing. Ian, you.
Mark, just to come back once again to the whole idea of Haredi conscription. The issue here, I believe, is one of numbers, and it's very difficult. This once again goes to strategy. Exactly how big an army does Israel need? Because if you look 50 years ago in 73, Israel managed to fight what was a comparatively short war on 3 fronts with a much smaller population, much smaller army than they're talking about today, with a population that's almost 3 times the size and an army that's probably at least double, if not 3 times the size, with all the reserves. How big an army does Israel need? Why does it need?
There are 2 parts to that question. Number one, I agree. First of all, I'm against the fact that we don't have a defense policy, and we need a defense policy to decide how big our army has to be. And in order to decide that, we have to have make all the lessons from this war. But let me make two comments relating to that. One, a quote from the conference the other day, which related to an historian who talked about one of the comments that Ben Gurion made, who stated that a 1-day delay in the drafting of the reserves, mobilizing the reserves, excuse me, more correctly, can be the difference between the existence of the state and not the existence of the state. And let's keep in mind the fact that Israel in the time when I first made Aliyah in 75 had a much smaller standing army, no question about it, a much smaller standing army. Not a smaller Air Force, mind you. We had probably a bigger Air Force, but leave that part aside. But we had a reserve. Don't forget, Israelis, when I first made Aliyah, were doing reserve duty until the age of 62. Everybody was doing reserve duty until like 62. So it wasn't the exception, it was the rule. So you had a much deeper reserve. And also, both in the 6-day war and Yom Kippur, we had all of the reserves mobilized, all of it, not half of it, not a third of it, not a third at a time. We literally had the whole reserve. Look, think about the 6-day war that was called the period of the waiting period. And one of the reasons we had to go to war when we did tactically was we couldn't keep the army, which was the whole civilian population, at the front forever. We didn't have people, kids took over being postmen. We forget that basically there were no males at all in Israel in the days leading up to the 6 Day War because everybody was drafted. We couldn't live that way for a year. Where would our industry be? What would we be turning out? It just doesn't work anymore. And again, one of the key questions was we have to have very quick wars. Why do we have to have very quick wars? Leaving aside the world, and the longer the war goes on, the worse it becomes in terms of world public opinion, but also because we need all our reservists. We got to get them all out there. We get them all out there. We have a war, takes 5 days, 10 days, and then they go home. It doesn't work if we got to be a fight for a year and a quarter. And so if you fight for a year and a quarter, you need a much bigger army. And then, of course, there comes the question, hermetically, we never had troops on every border all the time. Is that what we need right now? Maybe the answer isn't this again. Maybe the answer is no, we don't need troops everywhere, but we need 200 drones over the border at any given time tied to AI so we can see every movement at every time and every second. And maybe we don't need 200 troops, but we need 200 drones, most of them armed. Maybe that's a solution. I'm not necessarily suggesting that, but no one's making that thought that maybe it's drones we need, not more soldiers. But those are fundamental questions that require fundamental people to ask those questions. And it's easier just to say, well, we need more people, but we do need people. That's the problem. And without changing the design of the army, we need more people because we need people on more borders. And at least that's what people believe. We need more people on more borders, and therefore we need more people, and therefore we need the ultra-Orthodox. But look, we have this problem beyond all that. Keep that in mind. They now make up 12, 14% of the population, but they make up 25% of the 18-year-olds. 20 years from now, they're going to make up 35 or 40% of the 18-year-olds. So at what point, if they don't go into the army, does it squeeze everybody else out? And at what point can it not continue? And if we don't stop it now, the rest of us can't work forever for them. And that's what it amounts to. So.
But Mark, you know as well as I do that having a bigger reserve is not effective unless they keep training. And that takes a lot of time and effort and money, and commitment. But anyway, enough said.
Absolutely needs to be done. But if we want our defense, or we need alternative plans, we need to think of it in an alternative way. But we haven't thought in alternative ways. There's no thinking outside the box. Part of the problem is technology was undermined in this war because we had this big high-tech fence and it failed us. Bulldozer went right through it. Well, obviously it was a failure of technology. It wasn't so much the fact that the technology failed, it was a failure of concept. Why were there only 2 drones? We're the foremost experts in terms of drones, in terms of technology. However, Ukraine is producing 1 million drones this year. Why don't we have 50,000 drones over Gaza at every given moment? Why can someone in Hamas move 10 feet and we don't automatically know where they are at any given moment? Because we haven't looked at that way. We haven't thought of it in that way. Again, I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm saying that those are sort of the questions that should be asked, and maybe they are the answer, maybe they're not the answer, but somebody better answer these questions, and they're not. Richard, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Did you see an anti-Semitic component in the Vance-Trump attack on Zelensky?
Okay, so I read an interesting article, and I guess it was in Substack, where basically that was the argument that there was clearly an anti-Semitism involved, that there's a certain level of anti-Semitism, and certainly in the Russian propaganda against Zelensky, there's clearly anti-Semitic propaganda in it. Look, I'm of a strong belief that what's happened in the United States over the last 2 years and even longer, but the Russians have done a very good job of getting their message across. They're deeply infiltrated in the right-wing media sphere, and they've gotten their message against Ukraine very deep amongst the MAGA people who are all reading from the same sources that are probably deeply, deeply infiltrated by the Russians. And so the anti-Zelensky rhetoric is clearly influenced by the Russians. And once again, whether Putin is or is not an anti-Semite, certainly the Russian propaganda can be very anti-Semitic. So the answer is it could be, but it doesn't have to be anti-Semitic to have been disgusting. What can I tell you? It was one of the low points in American recent history in my mind. But I'm sure, as far as I understand it, a lot of Americans thought it was great. This upstart, maybe an upstart Jew, this upstart was suddenly put in his place by Vance and Trump. So I don't have the answer. I can't get into their minds. There's clearly some element of the the opponents of Zelensky are clearly, some of them are anti-Semitic. And people tell me, well, the Ukrainians are all anti-Semitic, but they voted for Zelensky. And right now he has 67% approval ratings in Ukraine. And he's a Jew. And he's clearly a Jew, and he doesn't hide the fact that he's a Jew. So Ukrainians have a checkered history, but so does a lot of the world have checkered histories. So that's where we stand. Okay, everybody. I thank you all. For those of you in the New York area on the 20th, which is a week and a half from Thursday, not this Thursday, but the Thursday after, I'll be speaking at the Westchester Jewish Center. So you're all welcome. I think it's 6:30 in the evening. The updates may be a little bit uneven the next couple of days. I'm coming to the States in the middle of the week, but we'll try to keep them going, either myself or with a couple of guest posts the day afterwards. I'm also planning to add a podcast that will go with the updates sometime after our return. So sometime probably right after Pesach or around that period of time, where it'll be somewhat talking about what's in the update and with some interviews thrown in as well. If people have ideas, please let me know. More feedback would always be appreciated. I'm experimenting with different things, and I would love to get feedback. I don't know what people thought of these. I'd use two, podcasts created by LLMs by Google, which I put in for two different events. I thought they did a really good job of describing the situation. I didn't get any feedback, so please, people, when you see things new, just drop me an email, say something so I know whether you think it's good or bad, and I can improve what we do as we go forward, going forward. So thank you all. Have a great evening, and I hope to see some of you at Westchester Jewish Center in a week and a half.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Safe journey.
Thanks.
Have a great trip to America.
Thanks.
Thanks for your
Thank you.
podcast.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michael.
Thanks, Mark. Will the Westchester Jewish Center be on Zoom also, or just in person?
I think it's just going to be in person. It'll be up to them whether they want to record it.
Okay.
First
time,
no.
I can't make that date. That's all. Okay. Anyway, take care
Take care.
and have
Bye.
safe travels.
Thanks.
And I'm happy Purim.
Thanks.
Bye.